3 days before Pope Leo X was due to address the world from St. Peter's Square, 12 of the most influential diplomats accredited to the Holy See were summoned to a private room inside the Vatican. They were not invited to a ceremonial audience. There were no cameras, no journalists, and no diplomatic pleasantries. They were brought together because the Pope had received a secret dossier containing allegations of suppressed humanitarian crises, financial networks, censorship orders, and corporate involvement in the displacement of vulnerable populations. And according to those familiar with what happened inside that room, Pope Leo looked directly at the diplomats and delivered 5 words that would define everything that followed. We can no longer remain silent. What happened over the next several days would create an extraordinary confrontation between the Vatican, foreign governments, powerful corporations, and even senior figures inside the Church itself. At the center of it all was a 31-page document that arrived at the Vatican's Secretariat of State on Saturday, May 15, 2026. The dossier had no official author, but its contents were explosive. It reportedly contained satellite imagery, financial records, names of officials, bank statements, and censorship orders allegedly signed by senior political figures. Its central claim was that 3 G20-linked states had systematically suppressed information about humanitarian crises unfolding in war zones. The document eventually reached Cardinal Matteo Bruni, described as one of the Pope's closest advisors. Bruni reportedly read it twice. Then he went directly to the Pope's private study. There, he placed the dossier before Robert Francis Preva, described in the speech as the first American Pope, and a leader who had already begun fundamentally restructuring the Vatican. Pope Leo X opened the file. For nearly 40 minutes, according to the account, he read in silence. Cardinal Bruni watched as the Pope's expression gradually changed. When Leo finally looked up, he did not ask for explanations. He gave one instruction: bring me the ambassadors. That sentence transformed a secret dossier into a diplomatic crisis. The Vatican is not merely a religious institution. It maintains diplomatic relations with more than 180 states and holds observer status at the United Nations. Under Pope Leo, those diplomatic channels were being used with a greater degree of directness and urgency. And now, the Pope was preparing to use them in a way that could put the Holy See directly at odds with governments around the world. The summons went out on Sunday, May 16. 12 ambassadors accredited to the Holy See were contacted through official channels and instructed to attend a confidential meeting at the Apostolic Palace. The language was strikingly different from the Vatican's traditionally careful diplomatic style. The message referred to urgent moral obligations. Then came the phrase that reportedly unsettled the diplomats. His Holiness expected absolute openness. 3 diplomats initially attempted to avoid the meeting. 2 cited scheduling conflicts. 1 did not respond. But within hours, a second message arrived from the Pope's private secretary. The message was brief. The Pope understood their concerns, but considered their presence essential. Their absence, it said, would be noted. Within an hour, all 3 had accepted. The following morning, Rome was covered by a heavy grey sky. The 12 diplomats arrived separately in inconspicuous vehicles and entered the Vatican through a discreet side entrance. They were escorted through restricted passageways and eventually brought to the Sala Bologna, a room normally associated with intimate audiences. There were no photographers, no television cameras, and no press corps. Only 12 chairs were arranged in a semicircle before a wooden armchair. Pope Leo was already sitting there. That detail was significant. According to the account, the Pope's early arrival represented a deliberate break from normal protocol, under which the pontiff traditionally enters after his guests. This time, Leo was waiting for them. There would be no ceremony, no extended greetings, and no diplomatic theatre. Each ambassador received little more than a curt nod. Once the final diplomat had taken a seat, the doors closed. 2 Swiss guards remained outside. Inside were only Pope Leo, the 12 ambassadors, Cardinal Bruni, and a protocol officer from the Secretariat of State. Then the Pope began. His voice was calm, deep, and precise. Each of your countries claims to respect human dignity, he said. Some had written that principle into their constitutions. Others had committed themselves to it through international treaties. Yet, he continued, governments often invoke human dignity when it serves their interests. Then he delivered the central challenge. Today, I will show you what their silence truly looks like. Cardinal Bruni distributed copies of the dossier, but the diplomats were given little time to study the documents. The Pope summarized the evidence himself. He described three major cases. The first involved a Southeast Asian state, where pro-government militias had allegedly displaced more than 200,000 people from resource-rich territories. Journalists were reportedly denied access to the affected areas. Local reporters were arrested. Critical voices were suppressed through targeted disinformation. According to the dossier, that disinformation campaign was financed by a European arms company with close ties to a G20 government. The second case concerned a North African country facing a devastating famine, threatening nearly 1 million people. Aid organizations were reportedly blocked at the borders. Satellite imagery allegedly showed grain shipments being diverted to military bases instead of reaching civilians. Financial records contained in the dossier reportedly documented payments from a Middle Eastern sovereign wealth fund to senior officials within the country's interior ministry. Those payments allegedly coincided with a news blackout surrounding the crisis. Then came the third case. This one reportedly involved Latin America. Indigenous communities had allegedly been displaced to make way for a massive lithium project. Behind the project stood a powerful consortium of companies headquartered in 3 countries represented in the Vatican meeting. The dossier reportedly contained internal corporate emails showing that executives had been warned about potential human rights violations. According to the documents, the project continued anyway. The executives allegedly believed that the controversy would never reach the international public. Pope Leo presented all 3 cases in less than 20 minutes. He did not shout. He did not openly accuse any individual ambassador. He simply presented the evidence as described in the dossier and then leaned back. For nearly a minute, nobody spoke. Finally, the French ambassador responded. The envoy expressed gratitude for the audience, but argued that the situations involved complicated geopolitical realities, requiring careful and nuanced responses. The Pope interrupted, politely but firmly. "Monsieur Lombard," he said, "I did not summon you for nuances." Then came the line that reportedly froze the room. "Nuances are the excuses of those who don't want to do anything." The Pope continued. "Children," he said, "were dying while governments calculated their interests." And then he revealed what made the meeting far more serious. He was not proposing another committee. He was not announcing a working group. He was not asking for another diplomatic summit. He told the ambassadors that within exactly 72 hours, he intended to make a public address. In that address, he would reveal the evidence, including the names of the corporations and states involved. The diplomats reacted immediately. One reportedly raised his hands in an attempt to calm the situation. The British ambassador warned of severe diplomatic consequences. But the Pope remained unmoved. "Diplomatic consequences," he repeated. Then came an extraordinary response. "You are speaking to a man who is accountable only to God." He then clarified what consequence truly concerned him. "The only consequence I really fear is silence." He said he feared that the Church could become complicit through inaction. "That's what bothers me at night." The meeting ended shortly afterward. There was no official explanation. The diplomats left through the same discreet channels through which they had entered. But outside that room, the diplomatic machinery was already moving. Encrypted communications began circulating. 4 foreign ministries reportedly called emergency meetings. Within hours, the U.S. American Foreign Ministry requested an urgent telephone conversation with the Vatican Secretary of State. But according to the account, Pope Leo had anticipated the reaction. Archbishop Ferrara had reportedly been instructed in advance to answer the call, listen carefully, and respond with exactly 4 words. "His Holiness remains resolute." That was the message. But while the diplomatic confrontation intensified outside the Vatican, another battle was developing inside it. Senior cardinals reportedly began expressing concern. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle was among those said to have warned about the possible consequences. Publishing the dossier, critics argued, could place diplomatic missions in at least 6 countries at risk. Even the retired but highly respected Cardinal Christoph Schönborn reportedly sent a handwritten letter urging extreme caution. And Cardinal Bruni himself, despite having delivered the dossier to the Pope, was said to favour a more cautious approach behind closed doors. But Leo did not abandon the plan. Instead, he expanded it. He decided that his speech should not merely expose 3 individual crises, He wanted to challenge what he described as a larger system of global indifference. On Tuesday, May 17, the Pope reportedly spent hours alone at his desk, writing the speech by hand on plain white paper. The drafts that reached close collaborators reportedly looked nothing like a conventional papal address. There were no long theological arguments and no carefully softened pastoral language. Instead, the tone was described as that of a prosecutor. Leo wrote about what he called the architecture of silence. He argued that governments did not merely ignore suffering. They sometimes created systems that allowed suffering to remain invisible. He wrote about financial structures that protected money flows, while ordinary people remained trapped in poverty and displacement. And he formulated the sentence that would become the centerpiece of the speech: "We cannot remain silent." Then came another line: "Silence is not peace, but a silent declaration of consent." As the Pope worked on the speech, the diplomatic counterattack continued. On Tuesday afternoon, the ambassador of one of the countries named in the dossier requested urgent crisis talks with Archbishop Ferrara. The meeting lasted approximately 45 minutes. According to internal reports described in the account, the diplomat delivered what amounted to a warning. If the Pope went ahead with the speech, the government could downgrade relations with the Holy See, expel Catholic charities, and encourage other countries to take similar action. When Ferrara reportedly carried the warning directly to Pope Leo, the Pope responded immediately. "Tell him that if he expels our people, I will personally fly there and take their place." The statement was dramatic, but the people around Leo, according to the account, understood why it was being taken seriously. He viewed the papacy not as a shield protecting him from difficult situations, but as an instrument through which the Church could act. Then another challenge emerged. On Tuesday evening, 7 conservative cardinals reportedly drafted a confidential letter to the Pope. They questioned the reliability of the secret dossier. Their concern was not simply political. They warned that the Pope could be relying on intelligence from anonymous sources that had not been independently verified. They suggested that outside actors might be attempting to manipulate the Vatican's moral authority for geopolitical purposes. By Wednesday morning, the letter was reportedly sitting on the Pope's breakfast table. The account describes Leo reading it while eating dry toast and drinking black coffee, a habit attributed to his years in Chicago. His reaction surprised those around him. Instead of dismissing the critics, he invited all 7 cardinals to lunch. For 90 minutes, he listened. He reportedly took their objections seriously. More importantly, he acknowledged that 2 financial documents contained in the dossier had not yet been sufficiently verified. He immediately ordered his team to confirm the information through independent channels. But when one cardinal suggested postponing the speech indefinitely, the Pope reportedly put down his fork. Then he spoke about the history of a church that, in his view, had sometimes acted too late. "Brothers," he said, "I have spent my entire life in a church that was late. Too late to Rwanda, too late to the abuse scandals. I will not be late again as long as I sit in this chair." The discussion ended there. The cardinals reportedly left in silence. Wednesday then became one of the busiest days inside the Vatican. The press office began preparing for what staff reportedly called the Great Fallout. Press kits were assembled. Confidential briefings were arranged with selected journalists. Translators worked to convert the Pope's handwritten Italian speech into 12 languages. At the same time, information continued arriving from the Vatican's worldwide network of nuncios, bishops, and missionaries. Reports from the Southeast Asian crisis region were becoming increasingly alarming. Villages were reportedly being cleared by force. A Catholic mission hospital had been forced to close. When that information reached Pope Leo on Wednesday evening, the account describes an unusually intense reaction. He reportedly did not shout. Instead, he became visibly determined. He immediately took up his pen and added 3 paragraphs to the speech. The new section described the hospital's closure, including the date and the military unit allegedly responsible. The source was identified as the personal testimony of Maria Consolata, a 67-year-old Filipino nun who had reportedly served at the hospital for 23 years. Leo ended the new passage with a direct question. "You have closed a hospital that healed your own citizens. In whose name and for whose benefit did this happen?" By Thursday, May 18, the speech had reached 27 pages. But then, at approximately 10 a.m., an unexpected message arrived. It came from the leadership of the famine-stricken North African state. Instead of using conventional diplomatic channels, The government reportedly sent the message through a personal intermediary, a retired general who had converted to Catholicism 15 years earlier. The message was remarkable. The government reportedly acknowledged serious failures and offered to open 2 key border crossings for humanitarian aid convoys, under international supervision, within 48 hours. But there was a condition. The Pope was asked to soften the language concerning that country in his upcoming address. Leo reportedly spent an hour considering the proposal. He consulted Ferrara and Bruni. Then he withdrew to his private chapel and prayed alone for nearly half an hour. When he returned, his decision was final. He would publicly praise the government for opening the border crossings. He would present the concession as an example of courage and conscience. But he would not remove the critical passages from his speech. The reasoning was straightforward. If the Vatican softened its criticism in exchange for a concession, Leo believed, its credibility with other governments would be weakened. The Pope was therefore preparing to acknowledge progress without abandoning the larger argument, and that larger argument had been developing for much longer than the dossier itself. According to the speech, Leo's approach had been visible since the beginning of his papacy. His choice of the name Leo X was described as a deliberate signal, invoking predecessors such as Leo the Great, and symbolizing a willingness to confront abuses directly. During his first year in office, he reportedly restructured oversight of the Vatican Bank. He established an independent ethics committee with authority to enforce its decisions. He also dismissed 16 bishops who were allegedly involved in financial scandals. At the same time, he established direct channels with leaders of Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. The purpose, according to the account, was not simply theological dialogue. It was practical cooperation on issues such as refugee crises and climate disasters. Viewed separately, these actions might appear unrelated, but together, they suggested a broader strategy, a church that wanted its moral authority to have practical consequences. That is why the Friday speech mattered. For Leo, the central question was not whether the church could speak. The church had always spoken. The question was whether its words would lead to action. A leader could deliver beautiful speeches about justice while avoiding the names and systems responsible for injustice. But, in Leo's view, that kind of silence could eventually become a form of complicity. The Church's greatest influence, therefore, would not come simply from its doctrine or from the enormous number of people who identify with it. It would come from its willingness to speak when others remained silent. And now, all eyes were turning towards St. Peter's Square. The Pope had the dossier, the diplomats had received their warning, governments were preparing their responses, senior cardinals had challenged him, humanitarian developments were still unfolding, and one government had already offered a concession in an attempt to soften his message. Yet Leo had refused to change the central argument. The world was waiting to discover what he would finally say, because this was no longer simply a speech about 3 humanitarian crises. It had become a test of how far the Vatican was willing to go when moral conviction collided with diplomatic pressure. And at the center of that confrontation stood Robert Francis Preva, the quiet boy from Chicago who had once entered the Augustinian order. Now, according to this account, he was preparing to step before millions of people and deliver a message that could reshape the conversation surrounding the church, governments, corporations, and global responsibility. The opening words were already decided. The evidence had been assembled, the criticism had been written, the warnings had been heard, and the Pope had made his choice. He would speak. Because, in the words at the heart of the entire confrontation, we can no longer remain silent.